Me. I'm Dianne Dredge and I'm hosting today's webinar. It's the first in a series of two webinars that we've got going on. This one we're going to talk about tourism, and the one next week we'll be talking about events and really just trying to come to terms with some of the strategies and actions and talk about some of the ideas that have been circulating. So it's now more important than ever that we start to think about how we really lead out of this this pretty much crisis. I had to use that word, but to COVID has really sort of brought us to a point where we really need to think about the future of tourism, events, and the visitor economy more generally. And so far, the focus has really been on just really trying to shore up businesses at the moment. But how do we actually lead out of this and really lean into this opportunity to innovate and to really, build that competition and that leading edge out into the future? So that's what I'd like to talk about in today's webinar. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your points of view and also to answering some questions that you can put in the question and answer facility that we've got. Now, I'm joined by Natalie O'Brien. Many of you might actually know Natalie. I think you would, because she's former CEO of Food and Wine Victoria, an organisation that I think has got a reputation for being really innovative in the way that they work in tourism and events. She's currently interim CEO of Ballarat Regional Tourism, and Nat's also been working with VTIC down there. And she's been working in VTIC on their committee to do with the tourism recovery. Nat's also a member of several boards, including on William Angliss, the Skills Advisory Board, as well as Victoria University's Visitor Economy Board. So I can think of no better person to have this chat with about the future of tourism in Ballarat. So welcome, Nat.
Wonderful, and good afternoon to everyone. Firstly, before I start, I really want to acknowledge the incredible resilience and strength and ability for industry to keep pivoting. And I'm watching very closely through social media what's happening in Ballarat, the take-home meals, the incredible masks from Hattie and Wolf, and the photo biennale, and of course the Plate Up Ballarat Pasta Challenge that's going on, and of course all the virtual footage that we can see for when we can come to Ballarat. So incredible strength and resilience that we're going to have to sort of put shoulder to shoulder as we come out the other side. I think one of the things that's going to be really critical for us as I sit around some of the recovery forums is this ability to have really strong leadership and a really clear plan to move forward. And I think more than ever, we're going to have to be incredibly collaborative, and we're going to have to really work in partnership. There is no greater time for us to really consolidate those partnerships. So I thought that I would sort of talk about the recovery from three little windows. The first one really is what's happening on a national level. What is the consumer sentiment saying, and what's happening in those other states where they have the ability to do some of the activities that we can't at the moment. And then secondly, as Dianne said, I've been on some of the recovery meetings, is actually having a look at some of the state planning that's going on. And then finally, to finish, looking at how does this apply to Ballarat, and what are the things that we can do as we plan together to come out the other side. So starting with the Australian consumer sentiment, and I've taken the Boston Consulting Group data to have a look at what's actually happening across the other states. And of course, this information was at the end of July, which means that it did take into account the fact that we were in stage 4 restrictions, but not a state of emergency, which is happening in Victoria. So I guess it's not unusual that Victorian consumers are feeling more risk compared to the other states, but I also think it's useful for us to actually see what sort of consumer behaviour is happening in those other states. And I'm sure, Dianne, you can also talk from the Queensland perspective. But the confidence in terms of the surveys is, although flat, it is becoming positive from the 2 surveys before this, and this is a monthly survey that's taken. And as restrictions have basically eased around the country, people have returned to in-store shopping, doing little indulgent things for themselves, and also entertainment with family and friends. And in this particular survey, when they were asked what their preference was for shopping, 61% preferred to go in store, communicate with the retailer and have that experience. And 22% preferred the online, and then there was another 18% that had no preference. So I guess what it's sort of really saying, there is still a very strong need for people to connect and communicate and make those transactions in a way that they would have in the past. In terms of the top purchases of what Australians are buying around the country, it will be no surprise that groceries is up there as number 1. But followed closely behind that, around the country, consumers are going out to enjoy cafes and bars and restaurants as well. And then followed by 12% and 11% with apparel and then homewares. And then there's this 13% of consumers who are still watching and waiting. They're a little bit nervous about heading out there and resuming that normal life that they would have had pre-COVID. Again, an interesting, and there's a bit of a divide in this, that for many, it's deemed very favourable to work from home. And so 50% of the people surveyed saying that they're preferring the flexibility. And this related a little bit to females who might be juggling a part-time job and domestic duties, is the ability to have extra time for not travelling was seen as a benefit. When the consumers were asked about leisure and travel experiences, 39% of those interviewed saying that they, in the next month, want to go and eat and enjoy in restaurants as they had done in the past. And 42% of those surveyed said, we can't wait to get out and enjoy travel and leisure again in the way that we had in the past. But interestingly, 46% of them said, but I prefer it to be much closer to home. And so destinations that are much closer to where I live will feel safer for the time being. So while consumers expect to resume to normal shopping and getting back out to eating, they did say that actually staying overnight and travelling further afield might be several months down the track in terms of their appetite to do that. The study also observed this continued willingness for consumers to actually buy local, and even if something costs more that it's locally produced, there's this really strong sentiment right through different demographics and millennials to actually buy and support local economies, which I think really plays nicely into the artisan for Ballarat. And then products that are supported by health and wellbeing are definitely a very strong priority. So I think this national consumer sentiment gives us a sense of some of the things that might resume back more quickly than others, and some of the areas like going back to work or travelling further afield that might be a little bit slower than some of those initial activities. So with that in mind, I wanted to talk really about what is happening on a state level. I have been working on, we've had a number of workshops talking about what will be needed to start that recovery journey. And there's probably 3 key takeouts that, that I think are worth sort of spending a little bit of time on. One is the competition, and we've sort of talked about this in many forums. It's probably going to be the most competitive domestic environment that we've ever experienced in Australia. So not only will we have Tourism Australia actually focusing on domestic market, we'll also have the competition from all of the states, but then overlaid over that, we're going to have the competition from the regions within Victoria. And when the airlines open up, we'll also have the New Zealand market as well, which will be another layer of competitiveness. So it's going to be really important that we bear this in mind when we start putting our planning together. The other thing is about restoring the traveller confidence, and I think we can see that there's going to be a cohort of people that are going to be a bit more nervous than the others. And I read, I think it was yesterday, that Accor has done a deal with a partner where anyone, I guess, sick in the hotel or not feeling well will have free access to medical assistance on the phone from their hotel room. So starting to think about what are the things that we're going to need to do to really make customers feel comfortable with the way forward. And then finally, building those comprehensive plans about reinventing destinations and innovating them, but also at the same time being incredibly agile to the changes that are going to happen during that period. So it's really an opportunity to see how we rethink the visitor economy and how we rethink some of the things that we've delivered before. And I think next week's sessions about events is there's definitely going to have to be some rethinking about events in the short to medium term in terms of how they can be delivered. I just wanted to go through a couple of the directions from a state level so that we can then implant what we might consider for Ballarat. So Visit Victoria has communication plans ready to be fired off at that moment in time where it's safe to do so. And there are a couple of key things that they're thinking in our planning that I think we can apply to Ballarat as well. One of their key roles is going to be to stimulate demand and really make sure that we start to sort of flow people around the state. And in their research and the work that they've done in doing so has really looked at the fact that Victorians know their state quite well, or think they do. And so one of the things they're looking at is how do we really look even deeper into our state and what we've got to offer, and also look at that emotional connection. How do we really connect Victorians to get in there and drive and get out to the regions? The other one is really driving that special and distinct experience. And I think for Ballarat, that will really be those stories and the people, and some of them will be big drivers, but some of them will niche, smaller experiences that together with those bigger experiences will provide a really compelling offer for visitors to come to Ballarat. One of the other things that's been talked about is this whole building a much more retail focused offering to really drive bookings and conversions. So I think it's really, things like 2 nights accommodation and this is the price, book it now, is really making it easier. And I'm probably not quoting Felicia correctly, but she has something like choose it, pack it, swipe it, that whole idea of let's make it as easy as possible for consumers to buy what we've actually got. I think the other thing is amplifying messages, and it goes back to that thing about partnerships, is how if we start to work together, and I think it was the Provincial that had packages a couple of months back that had art classes and yoga. The whole idea of packaging things together, meaning you can amplify the voices that are actually talking about those multiple things. Touring and drive, we've heard people are going to be comfortable driving close and staying close to home. So how can we dial up the nature and scenic parts of Ballarat and surrounds, the foodie sort of tours that people could do. Everyone knows I'm going to say foodie, but Ballarat and the Pyrenees and surrounding areas have got a lot to offer, and using Ballarat as a launching pad to get to some of the villages and regions in that area. And I think the final thing is really looking at, we've looked at lifestyle leaders in Victoria for some time, but it's going to be even really more important for us to drill down a layer and work out where we're going to find the consumers most likely to come, because geographic and a whole number of different variables, I think that's going to be really important. So to finish, I'd really like to then say, well, how do we take all of the learnings that are happening around the state and then draw in on some of the planning that the state has got, and how does Ballarat really leverage this going further? I just wanted to talk about a piece of economic modelling that was done right across the state, and there was a piece done for Ballarat specifically. And this was finished in May, where I guess the scenario planning did look quite different to it is now. but it did look at two different scenarios. One was more cheerful than the other, and one was much slower, but I would also add deeper now that we've moved into this stage. But one of the things that I took out of that study is that despite the large falls for both Ballarat and indeed the entire state, is that Ballarat is predicted to be comparatively better than many or most other regions around Victoria for a couple of really important reasons that I think we should use as opportunities going forward. So one is the fact that we have a higher proportion of locals to visitors who are using the services, particularly our cafe and retail outlets, etc. So therefore, the gap is not so big. And the other is the reliance on Ballarat for a visiting friends and market, which is incredibly important for Ballarat. So the whole idea that we, when we can open and it's safe to do so, is invite friends, relatives, weddings, parties, anything to come back to Ballarat is going to be a really important thing. And Ballarat has that very, very competitive edge on visiting friends and relatives. And the last one is really the short break market. Is that an interesting fact in Victoria? It's something like 53% of Melburnians have never stayed overnight in regional Victoria. So how does Ballarat position really close to the Melbourne market, and particularly growth corridors like North and West Melbourne that are growing exponentially? How does Ballarat capture on that, and what is it that we have to do to convince these people to stay overnight? So in closing, I think that we all appreciate it's going to be an incredibly tough road and a hard road. And I guess it really means that that ability for us to work together and to have that clear plan is going to be really critical. So I think if we really focus on the markets that we think are going to be the most likely to convert to Ballarat, we amplify the message by working much more closely with each other, building itineraries and partnering up with other businesses in Ballarat. And then we do a really deep analysis, which is happening through the traveller experience process, is to actually dig really deeply to say what is uniquely and beautifully special about Ballarat, so that we can represent that to this domestic market and very soon welcome visitors back to Ballarat. So I again acknowledge a tough road, but I'm looking forward together to work with the city and to all of the stakeholders in Ballarat in walking that road together. So thank you, and I'll hand back to Dianne to pick that up from here.
Okay, thank you, Nat. That's a really interesting overview. And I'm just wondering, actually, are there any timelines being talked about in the recovery committee that you're on?
I think the timelines are, I think the plans are well underway, and I think Victoria is really mindful that the other states have been out the gate a lot earlier and ready to go when their borders open. So I'm not sure if anyone from Visit Victoria is on the line today, but their plans are ready to go when it's time to get to that market.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's really interesting, because I guess I'm coming from a Queensland perspective, and I've been talking to a lot of people in the Queensland state and also internationally, I guess. And it really depends, I think, about the position people are taking about leading out, whether it's going to be, you know, kick back to business as usual as soon as possible, and, you know, let's just hope that we can get there, or how do we actually transition and lead out of this future, saying or thinking about a new future for tourism. So I think that's a very, there's lots of shades of grey in this debate about how we actually lead out. And I think from what I'm getting is that there's a real sense of wanting to lean in to leading out with a competitive and innovative edge, is what I'm hearing from you. Would that be right?
That's right. And I think the shades of grey, we've already experienced so much here in Victoria, and that's that sort of resilience and repackaging and re-offering. And so I think whilst we'll have a plan, being really agile to change that plan as required is going to be that shades of grey that we'll be experiencing.
And I guess the other thing is that I'm also being asked a lot about how to do it. Like, you know, people are like, how do we do this? Rather than really sort of try to reflect and think, there's a lot of give me a solution straight away. And I think there's a moment to really reflect and think and transition out of this with not too much of a reactive mindset, I suppose.
I think that's true, and I think that the audience and the consumer has changed. The operating environment that we're all working in is changed. And, you know, if we look at events, the whole idea of, you know, being in a room with hundreds or a space or a garden with hundreds of people is not the way that we're able to move forward. So we are going to have to reinvent and revisit the way some of our experience have been presented. And I think there's some really great examples out there of people doing that. And I think you're right, we're going to have to be ready, but we're going to have to sort of really go back to the drawing board and rethink and retest things to see if it's right for the market.
Okay, thank you. Well, I also have a presentation, and in fact, I actually forgot to introduce myself in this excitement of getting on with this webinar. So my name is Dianne Dredge. Some people might have already come across me or known me as a result of a webinar, or sorry, a workshop that I delivered in Ballarat earlier this year on behalf of Federation University. So I'm an adjunct professor at Federation University, but I also am the founder and director of a business called the Tourism CoLab. And the Tourism CoLab is an evolution of my thinking and where I've been both as a consultant planner and experience manager, visitor management. I was doing a lot of visitor management in North Queensland in the 1990s, did a lot of research and really have been embedding myself as a researcher in organisations as well as destinations for the last 20 odd years. And so I've really now started to develop this Tourism CoLab as a manifestation of how we need to try and move forward in a very collaborative sense. So I work across not only regions and localities in Australia, but I also do a lot of international research and a lot of international work as well. And so over the last, I would say 4 to 5 months, I've really been focusing on reconnecting with all of my international networks and trying to understand how different people are thinking. So I can add to Nat's perspective about what I see happening at the international level, but also really what it means at that very local level as well. So there's really 3 main strategies that I think that are emerging out of all of the recovery planning that I'm seeing and from the stakeholders that I'm talking to. Those 3 strategies are essentially, well, we have to increase our yield in terms of both numbers and generate more income. Very, very difficult to do at the moment. Obviously, you can't really increase visitors at the moment when different places have got different levels of lockdown. But we do know, as Nat said, that we're going to really be focused with a lot of local visitation and a re-emergence of local visitor economies or experience economies, then intrastate markets, and then we'll have the opening up of a wider domestic market and possibly New Zealand into that mix as well. So it's not so much about identifying new markets as we would do when we're trying to increase yield, but really try to understand the consumer's needs and their expectations and how that they are changing. And it's one thing to be able to look at the research. The research that Nat has presented is extremely insightful, but we also need to think about it in terms of bottom up about who are those new markets. And certainly everywhere that I've been talking to, they've all been saying that visiting friends and family is becoming a great deal more important, not because it's just the only or the predominant market that will re-emerge the most quickly, but it's also because people are really feeling an emotional connection that they need to make with friends and family now more than ever. And it's really slowed down our lifestyles and the way that we think about our personal connections and our connection to the special places, not only the special places that are important to our lives now, but the special places that were part of our growing up or part of where our families are. And so really thinking around how to pivot and to really develop and deepen some of those connections with existing markets is going to be really important. So the question about sort of increasing yield is really just trying to bring the existing domestic markets back into the focus again. And really thinking in terms of increasing visitor yield, really thinking about, well, I do know these markets, but what do I not know about them as well? Because these markets have now changed as a result of COVID. So we've got to be very, very careful about really reacquainting ourselves with those market opportunities. Another aspect of increasing visitor yield is obviously to reassess revenue streams. And I think that's really coming to the fore in terms of businesses that have been able to pivot to find new markets or to find new revenue streams. And that really does mean that we need to start to think innovatively about the different kinds of markets that we can reach, not just the traditional ones. So that first strategy about visitor yield is one thing, and states are really sort of going, yep, we've got to increase visitor yield, but that's a slowly but surely sort of approach. The second of the three strategies is about visitor dispersal. And obviously, again, you can't disperse zero visitors when you don't have visitors at the moment. So it is about really thinking into the future about who are those visitors who are going to come, if they're locals or if they're intrastate visitors, who are they and what are their unmet demands? Like, are there any demands that we can fulfill that we've never really identified before? Everything has kind of worked. We've taken it for granted before in many respects. And so now it's about really trying to map out those visitor journeys and try to really understand what are the additional connections and experiences, visits to certain places that may not have been in the mix of tourism and visitor experiences, but certainly might be able to deepen and build that stronger connection in the local community. So I think it's really important in that dispersed visitors strategy to really think about not just reacquainting yourself with the visitors themselves, but what are their visitor journeys. And I'd like to make the point in when we're talking about this strategy of dispersing visitors, is that I think it's actually really important not to think about it just in terms of itineraries. When we talk about visitor journeys and what are their itineraries, it's a good idea. And we are trying to deepen and increase the number of touch points and opportunities for the visitors to get to know the destination, but also opportunities to visit different cafes and to buy different products. And so you're looking to try and increase the number of touch points. But at the same token, if we think about it just in terms of itineraries, we're not really thinking about that business ecosystem. So, I know that there's a lot of everywhere in the world, everybody's starting to go, oh, we've got to talk about visitor journeys and develop itineraries. But along with that, I'm hoping to encourage people to really talk about the business ecosystems that are connected to those touch points where those visitors go. So itineraries, I think, in some ways just might superficialize the real value of thinking about those visitor journeys and how they can be developed and deepened. But it's this third strategy that I'm really most interested to pursue, and this is about capturing value. In most of the discussions I've had across the different DMOs and local tourism associations, people are talking more about trying to capture the value, not only the local value that's invested in the local visitor economy, but the regional visitors. How do we capture more of that value and make it stick in the local communities? And I think we've got much better strategies and ideas how to achieve the first two, increase visitor yield and disperse visitors. But when it comes to value capture, I think we've got less tools and strategies in place. And I think this is somewhere where we can really pay a lot of attention. So for me, and I did talk about this earlier in February, it seems like such a long time ago that I did that workshop, but I did talk about doing a community assets assessment and trying to identify new opportunities that may also be integrated into visitor journeys and to increase those touch points. And when I say a community asset assessment, when we do community asset assessments in the past, it's always been about, well, what can this community asset do for tourism? But if we flip this and we ask, so what can tourism do for this community asset? Then we're actually deepening that connection, and we're giving reason for some of these community assets. And what I'm talking about here are any type of community asset, such as community gardens or parks and gardens and this sort of thing, that don't necessarily have a place in a visitor economy, in the sort of previous visitor economy. They can become part of the new visitor economy, where we're trying to really deepen that connection with people and places and the stories that exist in those locations. So really thinking more deeply about a community assets assessment and how that can embellish the tourism offer is going to be important in the future. There's also been a lot of talk about multi-sided business models and really thinking about how we might be able to address non-tourism markets within our tourism business models. And a really great example of that, for example, is the way that guided tours in some locations, and I'm thinking about a case study in Copenhagen, where the guided tours have actually pivoted towards producing educational products, and those educational products are actually sold to schools, and as not only as visitor experiences later on, but as online learning modules to try and get across the value of that experience. And that actually takes or it can link to future market opportunities. So really thinking about, in not just delivering to different tourism markets, but what kind of other markets can you attract and offer products to. And the final one is what Nat has talked about a lot, is that I think almost on everybody's mind is, how do we develop and innovate in our products and our services, and how do we develop experiences? And so with all of the talk that's going on about products and experience development, it is going to be a very competitive world leading out of this, out of COVID. And so it's actually really important to take this time to really diagnose what's really special in your local community and what are those community assets, so that you can really make it very special and very unique. So how do we make diverse visitor economies work? Is the next slide available? Sorry, thank you. Thanks, Leah. So I really think about this in terms of that coming home strategy. It is about reinventing the familiar. What I'm hearing a lot is that it's very difficult to attract markets that are familiar with your products and experiences to get them to come back. So often it's about reinventing that familiar. But it's almost like, you know, a coming home strategy as well. Everybody loves to come home, put on that, you know, that cozy sweater, or, you know, those slippers, and they feel really comfortable. And that is actually where I think we've got a lot of opportunity, is to really reinvent that coming home and feeling familiar and safe and welcomed. So really focusing on that angle there. So reconnecting with family and friends, rejuvenating local assets in a way that we're retelling stories in different ways to connect with different people, and really thinking about this notion of transformation and how we can attract visitors who will really have an emotional connection. They will be transformed in terms of their connection with local people and places. But I think also some places that I've been talking to are starting to really think about rediscovering what their local economy means. I've been talking with places, for example, in Hawaii, the Aina Aloha Economic Futures Group is actually looking at really trying to reinvent what their local economy is all about. And they're really starting to talk about sharing and different kinds of exchange in a way that opens up new opportunities and new business models. So really sort of reinventing, and I'd encourage anybody to have a look at the Aina Aloha Economic Futures website and what they're achieving there. And finally, it is about transformative visitor experiences. And I think transformative visitor experiences, we need to think about them in terms of transforming oneself, transforming our connections with other people, about transforming the way that we think and feel about the world through learning experiences, and through transforming through our connection with history and with animals and with landscapes as well. So really thinking, you know, the label transformative visitor experience is one thing, but what does it really mean in your destination? So finally, how do we actually lead out of this? And in leading out, it's actually, I would suggest there's just a number of activities or initiatives that could be done. And I'm not familiar with the exact place that the experience economy plan is in, or the experience plan is in, but I would suspect that it would be a really great idea to undertake a community assets assessment, and to really look at community assets through the lens of how they can integrate into tourism to help deepen that sense of connection between tourism and the local community. It is about business model innovation, so really thinking about multi-sided business models and really trying to understand and pivot on different, how to reach different audiences, not necessarily tourism markets, but different audiences with the products that you're producing. It's about really trying to understand visitor business ecosystems and not get tied up too much with this idea of itineraries. Itineraries is great, but I think we need to, in order to build resilience, we need to really think about the ecosystems that underpin those itineraries. It's about transformative visitor experiences. And I think one of the really clever approaches that I've been seeing in a couple of Nordic destinations I've been talking to is that they're really trying to create a sense of, okay, this is a familiar location, so let's explore it again. So they're creating experiences that encourage people to explore and discover. So for example, this was a couple of years ago, but it's very much in process right now, is Copenhagen has been using its local craftspeople to build what they call hidden giants. And it's like a treasure map, but these hidden giants are built out of recyclable, sustainable products, and they're hidden all across the city. And you go and you find them. So it's a bit like a treasure map, but the experience of connecting with family, with friends, to explore, discover new places, and that uncovering of something that's completely new in a familiar place has been something that's really driven a lot of local visitor economy in that city. And finally, I think it's really important, if you are going to lead out of this, lead out of it and leverage that reputation that will inevitably emerge from this, because it's destinations that really grow that reputation holistically are the ones that are definitely going to attract more attention and more interest in what they're doing. So that's it in terms of my presentation. And I think we'll take it back to see, are there any questions that we can we open it up for questions now?
Absolutely. Dianne, we haven't got a question quite yet. So while everybody's thinking about that question, I think the community assets that you touched on in February is really interesting. And I was also thinking of the notion of that repeat visitation, is the fact that you feel so endeared or close to a destination, it's somewhere you like to go back. And I equate it to going to your favourite coffee shop or your favourite restaurant, because the owner or the guy behind the barista machine might know you. And that whole idea, I think it's again in the Netherlands or somewhere, where they would prefer people to come not superficially and take photos of the monuments, but actually come and truly connect and indeed come back. And I think that that's a really interesting thing that we could have a look at in Ballarat, is really looking at that return visitation, because people just endear themselves more deeply and deeply with all of the experiences in Ballarat.
Absolutely. And I think this connects with a concept that I came across in Latin America that that is about the welcome. It's actually, I mean, hospitable, right? We're supposed to be hospitable. And sometimes we forget about the welcome. And there's a couple of operators that that were being studied by a colleague of mine in Latin America, who really started to focus on the welcome and what that means, and how that connection, that actual process of welcoming visitors and making them feel that it is home, can really encourage repeat visitation, but also memories and word of mouth. It's like, oh, that was so good, I really connected, I love these people because I just felt like I was so connected, I had this great experience. And I think sometimes, you know, we forget, it's a cultural thing, but I do think that we could work on raising consciousness of that welcome as well.
Absolutely. So Dianne, I think everybody just needs to pop in if there are any questions just in the Q&A box. Is that right?
Hopefully everybody's really just processing these ideas that have emerged. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, from my perspective, I loved my visit down to Ballarat, but I'm really wondering what it is that that you could say is the unique qualities that really you're trying to pursue at the moment. Can I ask, is that too? I know there's an experience plan going on.
Yeah, so. I think that it is good timing, because I guess you keep revisiting what it is that's really special about you and keep testing that. And so we're involved in a process that's running at the moment. And in fact, we have a workshop tomorrow to really dig deep in terms of what does make it uniquely special and uniquely Ballarat. And I think what's great about the process, when so many people from across the industry are involved, you have some really good discussions of perhaps parts like the community or the gardens that you may not have thought of that come to the forefront. I think in our process we also have some people that are external, which also gives another flavour of what does it look like looking outside in. And so I think very soon we look forward to expressing the ideas that are coming up in those sessions.
Yeah, I really think that it's a journey. You know, it's not just something that can be put in a plan and there it is, and we'll put it on a shelf and we'll all refer to that. It is actually an evolution. So it is a question that needs to be asked periodically, but it's an ongoing. Yeah. Jody has asked a question. Was that right that 50% of Melbourne people have not spent a night in regional Victoria? If so, how do we market to them? Struggling to survive with no budgets.
Absolutely. So it is true that there is a big audience of people that haven't stayed overnight in regional Victoria. And I think that this is absolutely the opportune time to understand a little bit more about that market. And it may be a two-step process to get that market to come to Ballarat for day trips, and then actually build on that market to encourage an overnight stay. So some work has been done at the moment to really understand a bit more of it. Traditionally, state bodies and regional bodies have actually gone with a market that's much easier to convert and has greater propensity. But I guess because we're re-looking and recasting the markets, it will be a market that will be delved into. So that's certainly an opportunity, but it may be a two-step process to lure them across.
Wow.
It's
Sarah,
a big figure.
yeah, it is. And I'm going through my friends and colleagues and family in Melbourne and thinking, most of them have told me that they have not been to Ballarat in a very long time, or if at all. So just my anecdotal evidence is supporting that. Yeah. Sarah Beaumont has asked, what are your feelings about dispersing visitors into Ballarat surrounds?
I think the dispersal is going to be a really important part of how consumers actually consume Victoria. And someone was talking to me the other day about comparing it to Europe, for example. So you don't just necessarily say, I'm going to, do a touring trip through Paris or France. You might go through a neighbouring countries. And so I think that this is going to be a big part of what we see is people extending an overnight stay to 3 or 4 nights, and instead of going to different countries are actually going cross-regionals. So that's definitely something that Visit Victoria has taken into an account. And I think that when we see the revival of drive holidays, that will be the sort of things. And I think there are some dedicated touring routes that have been established in Victoria across many regions and across regional. It will be the opportunity for those touring routes to really shine and have consumers take on many regions on their short break.
Absolutely. I can actually remember that was one of my very first, when I graduated as an environmental planner, it was a strategy to try and disperse visitors and keep visitors away from very sensitive natural environments in North Queensland. And so we used a very simple strategy of identifying, in abstract terms, landmarks, nodes, paths, and districts. And we used those kind of metaphors to organise how to manage and influence the way that people travelled over the region. And it worked really well in terms of trying to increase scale at certain nodes and to keep people away from, very sensitive areas, as I said. So there are sort of some simple techniques and strategies that can be used in that respect at different levels, from state right down to local. So yeah,
I think that's true. Villages and landmarks or attractions or even accommodation can be the drivers for people, and often we get we forget that consumers don't realise they're going over regional boundaries as they take on their pursuit of doing the list of things that they're keen to sort of tick off. So I think that's always important to keep in the back of our minds as well.
We've got another question. How do we know our true value offer? That's very much a co-created question, isn't it? I know that the experience plan is trying to do a little bit of co-creation. Our true value offer is something that, in my mind, needs to be a shared discussion.
Yeah, I think it's a shared discussion, and it's also a discussion about who is understanding about who are the audience that are already appreciating Ballarat, and who is the audience that we want to reach out and extend to bring in there, and what is it deep in our DNA that we're working on at the moment to be able to express to people. And I think the other thing is that it may be that we have a number of markets that we're presenting slightly different sides of our personality, if you like. I think that, you know, all of us have different sides. Some, you know, some side might be more sociable on some days, is actually really, it might not be one dimensional, but there might be a number of things that we're using to bring people together to the destination in Ballarat. So, and, you know, I guess the other part of it is that you've got to be able to stress test these things and put things into market. And, you know, I think if we take lessons from startup companies, is trying a number of things as well. There's got to be a little bit of that, is actually really testing products and trying products and seeing what the reaction to the market is as well.
Yeah, that's right. This is a climate in which we just need to test quickly. I don't like to use the word fail, because nothing is ever a fail if you actually learn from it. So it's test and test and test again. So and the faster we can do that, I think the better. Yeah.
And I think, Dianne, because we do have you know, we have from demos moved a little bit from traditional marketing into much more digital marketing. It enables us, it's a much more cost-effective way for us to be able to test things as well. And so it does give us a bit more flexibility than we would have had many years ago when we put our brand campaign or our products into the marketplace, is particularly in the days when it was brochures and, you know, all of those sorts of things, is that we are working in a medium that allows us quick turnaround and is more cost-effective to put into the market.
Yeah, there's a lot of food for thought, that's for sure. We're just about up in terms of our time. I just thought it might be useful to have a quick word about the webinar next week. And the webinar next week is going to cover events. And my understanding is that, well, it's very difficult at the moment. Events has been probably harder hit than any other sector that I can think of. And so next week we're having Stu Spears and from Silver Linings, and he will be talking along with Alana Thompson from Federation University. So, and Nat, I hope you will join us.
Absolutely, I'll be there asking questions.
You've got enormous experience in the event space as well. So it's Tuesday next week at the same time at 3 p.m. So yeah, that's good. Have you got any final comments, questions, answers, observations?
No, I think that the fact that we've got all of these people together and we've got this process going on, I think that working together is going to be really exciting, and it's going to give us the opportunity to come out the other side refreshed. So again, I look forward to working alongside industry in the city as we make our way forward. It might be a bit stop-start, as we've sort of said, but you know, we'll be agile together. So again, great to be talking online, and look forward to joining the events discussion next week, which is going to be really interesting.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to host this webinar and the one next week. and let's keep the conversation going. And I can't reinforce enough just how important it is to just continue the conversation, because that's how ideas are generated, but also they really mature through conversation. So thank you, and I'll see you next week.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.